Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. So, my guest today is a 5 times founder, and he's also part of that group that I've been talking about a lot recently. This group of highly curated entrepreneurs from around the world, thought leaders, successful in many different areas of life, and have been part of this group because there's a certain specialness about them. So it's a real honor to be able to have this gentleman over here on the podcast. Now, he's the first guest that we've had, and I don't know, almost 200 episodes that is in this particular industry. He pioneers the therapeutic psychedelics industry. Now, he focuses on inspiring people through healing and inspiration through many different levels of consciousness. Now, he co-founded a company called Field Trip, which is the world's largest provider of psychedelic-assisted therapies. Reunion Neuroscience, which is on the NASDAQ, Canadian Cannabis Clinics, which was acquired back in 2016. And then he hosts the Non-Ordinary podcast. And I will say, nobody's ever called me ordinary, so I kind of like the name of that. So without further ado, Ronan Levy, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor, and it's a great pleasure to be here chatting with you today.
Oh, thank you. And that's an honor for me to be with you again. And, you know, one of the fascinating things about the caliber of conversations that we have there, you'll tend to notice entrepreneurs go through these different phases. And you see first-time entrepreneurs and first-time founders, and you'll talk to them and be like, so what's your goals? What's your ambitions? What's your projections over the course of the year? Like $10 million. Wait, $10 million over what period of time? Oh, yeah, within a year. Oh, well, you're much further along than I thought. Oh, no, we're pre-revenue. Have you started selling anything yet? No. It's like, okay. And then they get their first couple sales in the door, and they're already putting their deposit down on their McLaren and all this other stuff because they haven't gone through, those different phases. Then as you get more seasoned as an entrepreneur, as you get more seasoned as a CEO, you notice there's a massive transition in the level of conversation that people have. The teenager entrepreneur type, they obsess themselves over tactic, growth, tactic.
Yeah.
When we're together, we talk a lot about mindset. We talk a lot about the future. What do we anticipate in the next year? What do we anticipate in 5 years? What are the trends that we can take advantage of? What are the obstacles, the threats that are presented in the future that are threats for many people, but opportunities for those who are brave enough to take advantage of it? But to get to that mindset, and the beautiful thing about MMT, right, is we've got all these people there that are just deep into these conversations. But to get into these mindset, you have to have a mind that is willing to accept it and go to those places. So that transitions then into the work that you do, I imagine. Is that right?
To some degree. Certainly that was my aspiration when we started Field Trip. I've done a lot of work over the years personally, not actually with psychedelics. I'm actually relatively new to psychedelics. I had my first experience in the few months before we started Field Trip, feeling like maybe I should know what I'm talking about before we do this. But I had done a lot of work with meditation and coaching and therapy beforehand. And that's always been my aspiration, was to help elevate people, right? Field Trip and psychedelics and the way therapeutic psychedelics evolve, and it's just a function of our pure medical system, is you can't really use medicine for those kind of people. And so that was a little bit of a challenge in growing Field Trip, which is our client base was not the map makers, the MMTers. It was the people suffering with depression, anxiety, PTSD. Incredibly important work there as well. But the initial kernel of Field Trip was to, help the people in this conversation, the MMTers, go further and create mindsets and become more powerful people to create a different and better future.
Now, I'll be honest, I don't understand psychedelics very much. I don't understand the industry. I may be coming to the conversation with some preconceived, ideas and notions around it. All that being said, this is just one road that I've never really journeyed down. So, just tell me, what is psychedelics? And it's probably just been, poisoned by the drug industry, so to speak, like the preconceived notions, right? So I look at it as, as a drug, like a traditional like drug, like a bad drug, bad for the brain, that it will cause harm to my body. So I know that this has got to be something that I must have overlooked. So I'm curious. That's one of the reasons why I've been so excited to have you on this call, is because I don't like being in a position where I don't know something that other smart and intelligent people are leveraging.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your transparency and vulnerability and being open about that, because in this space, to sometimes own up to being like, I still don't understand it and I'm still a little bit worried by it. So I appreciate that. So I'll start by saying this, which is everything you alluded to in terms of being scared of psychedelics is not only incorrect, it's pretty much an outright lie that was instigated by political motivations, certainly not scientific. And I know that sounds like conspiracy theory stuff, but it is actually well documented that the war on drugs was started by Nixon for political reasons, to alienate the hippies and the counterculture and the Black community. That's pretty well documented, and that's what's happened. And it's terribly unfortunate, because the truth about most psychedelics, and let me speak about what we're talking about here. There's typically two classes of psychedelics. There's a class known as tryptamines, which are the ones like psilocybin, mushroom psilocybin, LSD, DMT, if you've heard of DMT, 5-MeO-DMT. They're a class of molecules known as tryptamines. They're all different iterations of a molecule known as dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is naturally synthesized in your body. It's thought that the white light and the experience you have when you die is your brain dumping a whole bunch of DMT in your body. It's probably what generates our dreams to some degree. So it's not entirely artificial. It's natural in many ways. Obviously, taking it exogenously from mushrooms or LSD increases the amount in your body significantly and creates the experience that we're talking about. But they're very natural in many cases. And there's a class of molecules called phenethylamines, which is MDMA or ecstasy, sassafras, mescaline. What we see with psychedelics, and right now, just to put the landscape out there, we're probably about 6 months away from the FDA approving MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD, which means this drug, this Schedule 1 drug that the government decided had high risk of abuse and no therapeutic benefit, is about to be approved as a medicine, and not just as a medicine, a incredibly potent medicine, right? The results coming out of the phase 3 trials for MDMA-assisted therapy showed that 1 or 2 MDMA-assisted therapy sessions, which more or less involve taking MDMA, lying on a couch with a couple of therapists present. There's pre-work and post-work, but that's what it is. Resulted in about 80% of people who had chronic severe PTSD for about 15 years, so they've suffered with it for a long time, no longer clinically meeting the criteria of having PTSD. That means they're effectively cured with almost no severe adverse events, right? So I can go into more depth that we see similar results with psilocybin, LSD, DMT. Like it's pretty consistent. In fact, one of the big catalysts for what we're seeing right now in this psychedelic renaissance, where everyone's talking about it, was Professor David Nutt, who was at Imperial College in the UK, was appointed to the UK's National Commission on the Misuse of Drugs, basically a drug czar, the guy who was brought in to kind of figure out how to solve the drug problem in the UK. And to his credit, David came in, he said, I don't want to take an ideological approach to this. I want to take a scientific and data-driven approach to how we address drugs. And so he commissioned a study, a multi-criteria study looking at a whole host of drugs, illicit narcotics, and a whole host, and looked at them in terms of harm to self and harm to others. And what he found is that the drug at the very top of the list in terms of harm to self and harm to others is alcohol. It is the most destructive drug in our society. The very bottom of the list, the safest, was psilocybin and LSD and MDMA. They were considered the safest in terms of harm to self and harm to others. And even many of them were below cannabis, which many people these days generally regard as pretty safe. I mean, none of these drugs are totally risk-free. No drug is, but generally pretty safe. And what we see happening, again, and it is drug specific, but generally speaking, when you ingest these drugs, you have a transformative, very often spiritual, therapeutic experience where a lot of emotions that we've been holding on to start to get released. I like to think about psychedelics working on 3 levels. One is they're immediate antidepressants. So you're often able to come back and encounter past traumas, past memories, things you're holding on to that you've never been able to let go of. All of a sudden you can let go of them. And almost, not always, but almost immediately sometimes people are like, I'm done. I no longer fear that, and it's gone. So you have this massive psychological processing. What people try to get to through coaching and therapy, which takes years sometimes, can happen in a single afternoon when aided with psychedelic. You have the mood lift. And then we actually see that psychedelics like ketamine and psilocybin actually trigger the brain into a state of synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. It actually causes the brain to physically heal itself, right? Wow. So we're talking like, when you think about all those things about how dangerous psychedelics are and how bad they are, it's actually by and large the opposite. Not entirely. Again, there's risks associated with it. You can have challenging experience with psychedelics for sure. And if not properly supported, it can create its own emotional traumatic event for sure. But in most circumstances where you're doing psychedelics in a properly controlled environment with supportive therapists, you're just having these powerfully transcendent breakthrough experiences. You can look at the data. It's out there. There's a lot of studies, right? Like, MDMA and psilocybin were granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, which means that the FDA decided, despite the fact they're on Schedule 1, that there was high significance of high likelihood of success and significant need. And that's why you see these clinical trials moving forward so quickly.
So let me jump in here real quick, right? So this actually is fascinating to me. And it goes to show, I think if we've learned anything over the last several years, it's to learn to question and just ask more questions about what is regarded as fact. And the more we ask more questions, and that goes with everything, not just health, it kind of goes with everything. You've been doing this for a while. You were in cannabis and other types of alternative or fringe industries, so to speak, right?
Yep.
What got you into those industries?
It's a function of personality and a function of circumstance, to be quite honest, which is I'm a trained lawyer. So I went to high school, university, got a business degree, went to law school. And so I've got the pedigree of someone who follows the rules, but deep down, I've always been the person who's like, why are things like that? I think it's always been in me, but it was reading a book by my favorite author, a gentleman by the name of Tom Robbins. And in Fierce Invalids, Home from Hot Climates, there's this one line about how in ancient Rome, they used to have an expression called eat the taboo, which was like anything that was taboo, question it, right? Eat it, break it down. And that's always just kind of been my thing. So when I've seen opportunities being like, why are things like that? I've always been inclined to kind of probe that a little bit and say okay, there's a reason for it, but there's also a reason that's not necessarily appropriate. I'm very open-minded to say some things are for some people and some things are for other people and some things are for neither. But let's give people a lot of liberty to make that decision for themselves. And then I got into the online dating space and as a lawyer, and that's where I just started to see the world through a different lens about how people's perspectives of reality and perception of reality and how different that is from reality in so many ways. And then, just circumstances. I got into the psychedelic space, really never having tried psychedelics. I got into the cannabis space, really never having tried cannabis, but I was like, I don't like cannabis. My attitudes have really softened, obviously, on both. Sure. But it's but why are we so afraid of this thing? Why are we putting people in jail for having a little bit of fun on a Saturday night? Can it be abused? Of course it can be abused. Anything can be abused. We all know that. But it seems really ridiculous to focus on these couple of things. And from a purely entrepreneurial perspective, it's product market fit was there. So it's kind of a great business opportunity. And then what happened when I got into the cannabis industry, and then we started opening up these clinics. That was the business model, even though I was skeptical of the medical application.
How many clinics did you open?
Yeah, we ended up with 30 across the country.
Wow. Franchised or all owned?
All corporate owned. We helped, last count I saw, we helped about 250,000 Canadians access the legal medical cannabis system in Canada.
And was this was through Canadian cannabis clinics?
Yeah, this was before I got into the psychedelic space. Yeah. And what I saw was that the people who were coming in were genuinely sick, genuinely suffering, and cannabis genuinely helped them. It was sick people being helped. And that really opened my eyes to being like, oh, like what other stories have I been fed that aren't true? And you start looking at the data, and the data is even more persuasive around psychedelics than it has ever been around cannabis. And so we jumped in.
Let's actually kind of jump into the business side of things for a little bit. When you look at the businesses, like trying to grow and scale a fringe business, if I may call it that, how are you growing these fringe businesses? What is the strategy that you're using?
Sure. I've always found it complex to try and deal in industries where there's so many competitors. I like finding like a little white space with a picket fence I can put around it where nobody is dancing and bring it into the mainstream. And I don't know that I think I was born with a little bit of a gift in being able to read the tea leaves about where things are going on like a social basis. And so I saw that with cannabis. I'm like, oh no, this is going to happen. And then with psychedelics, again, it was just an intuition. The story was we weren't in the psychedelic. I didn't know much about psychedelics. We had this one meeting with this woman who was interested in psychedelics, and she pointed us to three things. She pointed us to Michael Pollan, had just published his book, How to Change Your Mind. She pointed us to the fact, this was back in 2018, that MAPS had just been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, which tells you that there's something happening on a different level. Yeah. But the thing that stood out for me was in Canada, there were 4 or 5 online stores openly selling psilocybin mushrooms. Not big business, but it wasn't dark web. It was like, oh, the zeitgeist has changed. The world has changed. Most people just haven't become aware of it. And so I saw this great opportunity being like, the waves are flowing this way. It's happening. I'm not starting it. It's already happening. I'm just riding the wave. I'm going to get in front of it and try and scale really quickly. And so we took the strategy we had from Canadian cannabis clinics, which, to be quite honest, was fortuitous, which was we opened up our first clinic and it got overwhelmed with interest because so many people were interested in cannabis medicine but couldn't find a doctor.
Was there any marketing or advertising that went in before you opened, or you opened the door and word of mouth and referrals was what got people in the door?
It was at a time where we opened the door. I'd call the local newspaper and say like, hey, we're opening up a cannabis clinic. So you interested in writing a story on it? They're like, yes. There's been nothing interesting happening in Windsor for some time. This is great. And so we did a couple of stories in the local paper, and the demand was just pent up, and it was great. And truthfully, we thought that would happen with psychedelics as well. We thought that the pent up demand was there, and it might have been, but there were some fundamental differences in the business model, which is the cannabis business was covered by OHIP. It was covered by the provincial healthcare in Ontario, where we were operating. So people could come essentially for free. The cannabis wasn't free, but the medical appointment was free. With what we were doing with Field Trip, it wasn't. It was all paid out of pocket. So it was a different business model. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't scale nearly as well. But we created I think a massive dent in the world by, the thesis was right. The world was waiting for this, and there's so much interest in it. It was just there were just some aspects of it that made it a much different business that didn't scale in the same way that we had hoped and what we had seen with Canadian cannabis clinics.
Sure. Richard Branson was interviewed a long time ago, and they asked him about failure. And Branson said something along the lines of, I don't know why people have this illusion that I don't fail anymore. In fact, I fail more often today. The only difference is now I actually fail publicly and much bigger than I did before. When we looked at the cannabis clinics, there was a few things that you mentioned. One was there was a lot of momentum. Businesses don't fail because of a lack of a good idea, and they don't succeed because of a great idea either. Businesses win or fail because of either how they're leveraging momentum or the lack of momentum, which is, to go back to Richard Branson said that when you know how to leverage momentum, you leave your competitors trailing in your wake. Another reason why buying a business, which we just had Walker Dybell on the podcast recently, we talked about buying a business as a growth strategy. Buying a business is a wonderful way to increase that momentum, as is when we go into businesses and we help them grow. People think that we've got some sort of magic strategy when they find out that we've, grown a company from 950,000 to 50 million, or that, we've doubled, triple and everything. It's not that. Actually, we look to identify the areas of momentum that exist in the business. And then it's as simple as, how do we put more fuel on that existing fire? So momentum is a big one that you brought up. The other thing that you mentioned is the perfect formula was you're seeing a lot of momentum in an open market. In other words, a lot of momentum in an underserved market. So that was just a wonderful formula that went in there. I think when we looked, and you brought this up with Field Trip, while it was an open market, the formula, the variable in that formula that was missing was the momentum, at least in that particular area.
I think the momentum was there. I think some of the decisions we made operationally were right at the time, but we weren't fast enough to pick up and evolve it as the circumstance evolved it, to be quite honest. Like,
Sure.
to get doctors and therapists involved early on, we had to build a very conservative protocol, which created incredible outcomes for our patients. I still stand by the belief that the ketamine-assisted therapy protocol we developed is still the world's none. We saw people improve for 6 months or more after, one round of protocol, which just doesn't exist in mental health. The problem was it was operationally terribly inefficient. And so we were trying to build the plane while we were flying it. And so as we realized, like, oh crap, that does not scale very well, but we've already got New York up and running as well. We got to figure it out here. And then, clinicians we found were like very conservative protocols, and they don't want to make it less conservative. And so there's like these little things that just kind of stacked and stacked and stacked. But because we were trying to run that momentum and ride that wave, we weren't able to move quickly enough to write some of the early decisions that needed to evolve as we scaled. So it was different. There's a lot of lessons learned. They weren't even mistakes at the time necessarily, but just things that didn't get corrected in a timely enough way because of the size of the ship we had to turn.
And when you grew those 12 locations, and what period of time did you open up 12 locations?
So we opened our first clinic, and this was also, exogenous factors. We opened up our first clinic 5 days before the first lockdown in Ontario for COVID. And we got to 12 clinics by, within about 14 or 16 months. So we're just kind of like building through it, trying to build that infrastructure. But COVID certainly was a big headwind that had a significant impact on us.
So you grew it within 14 months, but that was also during a pandemic when the world was shut down, which gave you the inability to pressure test the systems and the processes that you were building. So by the time things opened up, everything was being pressure tested at the same time.
And at the time, we opened all the clinics, and most of us and like the founders never got there. We never met the teams. We had to do it all remotely because we couldn't cross the border. We couldn't travel. So there are a lot of things that we felt like the right decision at the time, but looking back, being like, that was fucking crazy. But again, there's a whole bunch of things going on in the background that made it the right decision at the time. So
a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, I want to double my business this year. I want to quadruple my business this year. I want to do all this other stuff. And I tell them, look, there's a couple things that we have to make sure that we're clear on. Thing number one is that the formula to double, triple, quadruple, or even just grow at 10% is the same. It's actions plus resources equal goal. So let's look at it right now. What are the resources that you currently have available to you? Or is any underutilized that we can maximize, or do we have to invest in more resources? The example of growing too fast in the middle of COVID, where really wasn't pressure tested, definitely caused some challenge. Sure. But I know we're pushing up against the clock. I want to make sure I'm sensitive to your time. This is the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. What would you say is your best piece of advice to the CEOs and founders that are listening that want to take their business beyond seven figures?
My biggest piece of advice is don't be afraid to push the limits. Don't listen to lawyers too much. Lawyers will always tell you the risk-averse decision, and they're usually wrong. But the line between what is legal and what Tom Robbins quote, which is at a certain point, you have to separate what is right from what is merely legal. And if you're trying to grow your business, step into those areas that, start to push comfort zones for a lot of people. Uber is the perfect example. They built a multi-billion-dollar business, breaking the law in almost every jurisdiction that they did. And it worked beautifully. I mean, there's challenges with the business, but that has nothing to do with it. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to look at the regulatory landscape and step where other people aren't going. And that's true about regulatory or even in just reputational areas, that if you bring good ethics and good rationale to things, you can make a wonderful business doing what other people say you can do.
It's funny. I run this program called my board of directors program. And right before our podcast, I was talking with all of them and we were laying out their 5-year vision. And I explained to them, I said, whatever your 5-year vision was last year back in December, assume that it is now done. It is already old. It is antiqued. It is not valid anymore. We need to reinvent that 5-year vision because technology has already taken a dramatic disruption with AI. And even if you took that into consideration in January and you said, okay, where does my business have to go now 5 years from now, it is already antiquated because just in the last 2 weeks, AI has made some of the biggest advancements that I had ever seen. I felt I was keeping up with AI until recently. Now I realize there's nothing I can do at the pace that AI is evolving to be able to keep up in the way that I have been able to keep up over the last, 8, 9 months, 10 months for that matter. You can use AI for the brainstorming, but, just real quick before we jump off, I just had this conversation with an attorney. Right. And she says to me, now that we're using AI, we can take 3.5 hours worth of work and we can condense it to 3 hours. I said, great. And the consequence of that is how do you ethically build people? So the antiquated model is billing by the hour.
Yeah.
That won't exist anymore. The future solution will likely be some degree of either value or subscription based or whatever that might be. There's so many different changes that are happening right now and across the board, every industry.
Yeah.
More and more people are ill prepared. And when you talk about being uncomfortable and fear and being crazy and whatnot, almost anything that you think you're going to do 5 years from now, 99% of the world is going to look at you and say you're crazy because it's going to have to be so significant and disruptive.
Totally. Even with the practice of law as a still practicing lawyer, it's like lawyers right now get paid for being risk averse. And as soon as AI can do all of the basic nuts and bolts, which makes up 95% of the legal practice, the remaining 5% is going to go to the people who are most willing to advise their clients to take smart, aggressive risk. That's it, and everyone else will be useless in the legal profession. So I'm very bullish in terms of what's going to change in the legal profession and help in many ways.
I know we're running late. Ronan, awesome to have you on the show. People want to learn more about you and the work that you're doing. Where do we send them?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, Ronan D. Levy, D as in David. If you want to listen to some of my conversations about success, entrepreneurship, meaning, value, all that kind of stuff, I have my own podcast called How We Evolve, a non-ordinary podcast. And those are some great places to find me. And if you want to read more about ketamine-assisted therapy, Dr. Mike Dow and I have a book called The Ketamine Breakthrough, which takes you all through ketamine specifically, but the rules and guidance are really applicable to all psychedelic-assisted therapy. So once we get you over the hump and get you past all of the misinformation you were fed as a child, well, that's a good book to start reading and make sure you're comfortable for when we get you over to the psychedelic side.
Beautiful. Awesome, Ronan. Well, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate you being here on the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. And also for our listeners that are looking for more tips, information, and strategies to create predictable and sustainable growth in your business, visit us over at predictableprofits.com. Again, that's predictableprofits.com. This is Charles Gadet with my friend Ronan Levy, and I will see you in another episode.